My name is Pernille Holtedahl. I'm a research fellow at the center. I'm joined very happily by Amanda O'Toole from Biodiversity, a biodiversity investor from Redwheel, as well as Will Pearse from Imperial College. So I feel we complement each other well. Will represent the serious science, and Amanda will represent the serious investors, and hopefully will give you a well-rounded look into the world of biodiversity investing. The way we'll run is I'll speak for about 10 minutes, then Amanda will explain to us how she works, what she does, will speak, and then we'll chat a bit, and then open the floor to the rest of you. So I will dive straight into what some of the projects, one of the projects I'm working on these days. So there is such a thing as biodiversity investing. There is such a thing as a biodiversity fund, which when they started coming up a few years ago, I was quite surprised by, because I was thinking, what on earth are they investing in? Because having worked in the nature space for many years, I was thinking, this is really hard, so I'm really curious to see what they're doing. So this asking this question then led me to looking into a set of funds. There's about 25 of them now that have the word biodiversity, nature, or ecosystems in their name. So they're labeled funds in this space. And I was curious about, well, what are they actually investing in? Are they investing in for good, or are they doing some sort of greenwashing, which we have labeled biowashing, just because it's related to biodiversity? That was my first question. We haven't found any conclusive evidence to suggest that that's the case, but that's the driving motivation initially. I'm not the only one asking these questions, so I've just gave you a couple of newspaper clippings. One is from the Financial Times a couple of years ago, or a year and a half ago, asking some of the same questions and using words like it's complicated and not clear. Environmental Finance showed us earlier this year that actually when you put all these funds together, it amounts to about 1 billion now, which in the finance world is a small number, but it's still 1 billion. So there is money going into these funds. So I'm just going to give you some stats that we found when we started looking into these funds. We just literally started by studying the prospectus and market data that we could find on them. And this is work that I'm carrying out together with Eva Kochi, who should be here somewhere today as well. These funds are, the size isn't very large. The largest one is 362 million euros. This is a few months old, this data, but it will be in that range. Most of them are active funds, so they actively pick their stocks. Only 2 are passive. For those of you that are into or know your EU terminology, you will have heard of SFDR funds. So are you an SFDR 8 or an SFDR 9 product? Most of these funds, or actually it's a fairly equal, but a slight majority are SFDR 9 funds, meaning that they have sustainability as an objective, not just as a concern that they look into. We then wanted to get to that key issue of what exactly are they doing. And again, this was something we found out by studying their prospectus and then interviewing some fund managers. And we came up with 3 categories, which we sounded reasonable, and people have told us resonate with them, although I'll ask Amanda afterwards if she agrees. And one is that there are some funds that are literally, what they're doing is that they're screening out the worst performers. So suppose that they want to invest, so these are listed public equity funds. They pick sort of common stocks, and then they screen out the worst performers, like a mining company, let's say, that's really has huge negative impacts for biodiversity. They would screen those out. Some appear to, reading their wording and looking at their approach and methodology, to be mitigating impact. So that could be investing in a company that, let's say, wants to reduce plastic, which could be a driver of biodiversity loss, so mitigating that impact. A very small number are seeking opportunities. And by opportunities, I mean opportunities in the new economy, the new nature economy, as we call it. So that could be, for instance, alternative proteins. Alternative proteins would reduce the biodiversity footprint of the food producing industry, because you're not using land. So that's, for us, sort of a new technology, an opportunity that comes with this space. It was also interesting, that's the last thing I'll say about these funds, to look at the industries. So on average, 30% of the fund's holdings were in industrials, 15% in information technology, and 14% in consumer staples. Those were the three largest sectors. And it's interesting in this respect to look at, okay, so are they investing in sectors that are actually relevant for biodiversity? And it would seem that to some extent they are, because then we looked at what sectors are considered the most exposed to biodiversity, and generally there's sectors like materials, real estate, energy, and food and beverages. And food and beverage, for instance, there's overlap with consumer staples, etc. What is interesting to know, though, for instance, not surprising probably for many investment professionals, is that investing in IT does not mean, I thought initially, oh, maybe they're investing in sort of interesting satellite, food crop satellite monitoring technology, but actually they're mostly invested in what we label the Magnificent Seven, so the Teslas, the Googles, the large stocks that tend to produce nice returns for investors. In conclusion, these funds represent biodiversity in different ways to investors. So they have different profiles, different metrics for choosing them, different strategies, which may not be a problem, except that we're not sure that investors are aware of that. Number two is that we would say ambitions are generally muted, in the sense of very few are seeking opportunities. Instead, they are looking at screening out possibly mitigating impact. Third point I want to make is that I'm not moralizing when I'm saying this. All I'm saying is, in fact, this is probably publicly listed equities are probably not the place looking for lots of real impact. These tend to be funds that are largely motivated by and bound by fiduciary duty. So they have to look for returns, etc. And there are other investment areas and space and investors that probably would be better suited to invest in these real on-the-ground impact, for instance, the private space. We said, okay, this is all interesting, but looking at 23 or 25 funds, and although that's growing, it's not going to explode from one day to another, we'd like to actually understand better how investors, more broadly speaking, are thinking of biodiversity. Many of them probably aren't, or if they are, well, it might be sort of a sideshow for them. So we are designing now and are hoping to launch shortly a global biodiversity survey where we're speaking to, or surveying investors globally about how they, along two lines. On the one hand, how do they incorporate biodiversity considerations into their everyday business? It could be that they're not, or that they're having some engagement. We'd like to know more. And what are their perception of risk? How are risks, according to investors, how are they reflected in equity valuations in the market? So these are the two broad lines of inquiry that we're using. We are planning to match the data we get from this, because that's the problem with the biodiversity finance space, is that there is very little data out there. And to match that, to look at how these perceptions match with portfolio holdings of these institutions. That is, to what extent are they actually reflected in what funds are investing in. I'm taking a step back now to place this in a context. So far I've really focused on asset managers, listed equities, that space. But that's just one way of investing in nature. And this very homemade, as you can tell, flower that I came up with for today's presentation, showing the limitations of my PowerPoint skill. Listed equities are listed as one of the petals of this flower in sort of a teal green shape. Together with other instruments that private investors can use to invest in nature. We have these two different shadings to differentiate between what we call financial market instruments, so your bonds, your equity investments, sort of easily to recognize, typically liquid products often, etc. And that's different from what we label nature market instruments. These are real investments in real assets, and typically have different investor profiles, return profiles, etc. But we just wanted to, I want to step back and put this, what I've talked about so far, in that context, and show you that there are many entry points for private investors who want to invest in biodiversity and nature. Although I should say, and coming back to a bit what Jim Ski and the previous discussion talked about private versus public finance, in nature, historically, about 80% of funding going or investment going into nature has come from governments. So the idea of getting private investment into nature is relatively new, and there are still questions around how we can improve it. Quickly on this, I'm now coming back to the background. So I first served you the findings, and this is just to show you even taking a further step back, but also wanting to make a segue into the discussion with Amanda and Will later on. I've been talking about nature and biodiversity interchangeably. They don't mean the same thing. I've tried to put some very short definitions up there, just so you're aware of that. They mean different things, and we'll get into that in more detail later. But quite often in an investment context, they tend to be used interchangeably, and often it's not a big problem. The challenge we're all trying to, or at least that have inspired me throughout my career, is how to get more money into nature, be that through public or private sources. And in the context of private, sometimes that means, and I put it a bit poignantly here, in the sense of making the uninvestable investable. So how can we make something that typically doesn't generate easily at least a return, financial return? How can you get private investors into that space? Lastly, as I alluded to earlier, there's been very little research in this area in the finance, in the academic finance literature. And although it's emerging now, and a lot is happening and has been happening for the past 18 months, part of our motivation is to contribute to that. The last slide I have is this. I figured although it's 10:15, you might be ready for a cartoon already. But it's really to introduce this idea of biodiversity metrics and how to measure biodiversity. This is one of the major challenges that private investors talk about when they say why they cannot invest, or why they're having trouble investing in nature, because you need a KPI, you need to be able to show what impact you're having, and depending on the situation, it can be quite difficult to measure. So that's, and we also have seen that for the biodiversity funds, we'll get back to in a moment, the metrics they use to both measure impact but also screen in and out companies vary widely. So what exactly, how can we move towards a better standardization without losing the nuance that we do need in this space? But it's not just investors, even institutions and companies that are not that, for whom, for instance, it's not that interesting to invest in nature, there's still quite a lot of them need to report. So there's something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and there are other initiatives and stakeholder pressure suggesting companies now have to report. There's still disagreement on, and companies struggling with how to report, what to report. The TNFD has something like between 17 and 29 metrics. So companies typically end up maybe reporting on one, and then another company reports on something else. So how do you compare those two? That's another challenge. But there is work in the space to streamline it by TNFD and others, for instance, and there's research and tool development in terms of how to present this to financial institutions and how to move towards some kind of agreement and consensus for biodiversity metrics, which I'm very pleased to be involved with here at Imperial College as well. So with that, I will give the floor to Amanda O'Toole to talk to us, give us a perspective of what it's like to be an investor in biodiversity.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm so excited to be able to be part of today, and so happy to see kind of so many minds applied to what is an enormous set of challenges. From my perspective, the way I came at investing in biodiversity is following decades of investing in more sort of mainstream climate tech that was looking towards really an energy transition. And what became apparent over the last 5 or 6 years has been that management teams of the more progressive of those sort of investee companies were starting to think about their footprint, their exposure really to the risk associated with the loss of natural capital, what that means for their businesses, and also the extent to which they are causing further degradation and what that means for them in terms of essentially transition risk, but associated with natural capital rather than the sort of conventional thinking about carbon emissions. And so companies were coming and starting to talk about how they could improve, how they could demonstrate where they're doing better and start to sort of map out that sense of risk that they could feel but not necessarily measure and report. And it's through that process that it's become clear there's an investment opportunity and a role for investors in this space. So thinking about the fact that there is a broader and broader recognition that we're living beyond our planetary boundaries, and that the ongoing degradation of the natural capital that we have is impacting ecosystem services such that we are sort of feeling tangible loss through basic human rights, the provision of basic human rights. And it's that tangible loss that's starting to drive policy change. It's driving changing behaviours amongst voters, amongst consumers, and to an extent amongst corporates. We're obviously right at the beginning of a transition. We by no means are seeing the progress that we need to, but there is change coming, and this huge sort of, all sector, all geography, all activity transformation that we're going to need to see over the many, many decades to come is huge. And it means that asset owners have to think about their risk because they are exposed to some of the threats, and their transition risk as we recognise change is coming, and also the ways in which they can be part of a solution and potentially at the same time sort of capture some of the opportunity on the positive side. And to me, that spectrum of asset owner thinking about where their exposure sits and what they can do with their capital speaks to those three categories that you're describing in terms of investment strategies now. So that's where I come at this. I think there is a huge opportunity, but there is huge risk in sort of apathy in this space. Asset managers, I think, are starting to address this for clients in, as you say, really three ways. So I would think about this in terms of trying to screen out worst performers or thinking about best in class. And that, to me, is the absolute bare minimum that a responsible investor ought to be thinking about, because it means that you are mitigating the very worst of the exposure to essentially transition risk in this space within your portfolio. And clearly it is also kind of akin to thinking about your reputation and your role in the world and what part you have to play in a future that looks viable. I think you described that as lacking ambition. I think that's fair, but it is a sort of a starting point. It does also start to slightly shift the cost of capital between best in class, worst in class, and that has some limited benefit in terms of real world impacts. The second way I think that investors are approaching this is by investing in transitioning businesses, potentially supported by engagement policies. And that speaks to this sort of trying to do better in terms of operations. I think there's a lot of value in that, and I think if large parts of the listed equity markets were to shift to strategies that adopted even just those two approaches, you'd see more significant, more rapid progress than we have now. So I genuinely think there's value in those two sets of solutions done at scale. We can talk about the problems with measurement and how that influences the ability to meaningfully engage and demonstrate progress with engagement. Clearly, those challenges are real, but I don't think it should preclude us from trying. However, I would also say that we can push corporates to do better through investing in best in class and that signalling effect. We can support that with engagement and supporting transitioning businesses. But the reality is that right now we don't have a full suite of solutions to all of the ways in which we are damaging nature. And we therefore need progress, because otherwise we're asking for the adoption of the impossible, in the sense that we don't necessarily have a solution to how exactly we're going to feed the growing population globally, whilst sort of committing to the deforestation targets that we need, whilst supporting the kind of competing needs for land and the competing land rights that we have in parts of the world. we need more solutions. We need better ag tech. We need to harness both natural and technological solutions to try to address these kind of challenges. And so we need to deploy capital towards more R&D, CapEx, scaling to improve the availability of technology and its cost. And to me, this is a really, really crucial part of what public listed equities can support. I think this backing solutions providers and encouraging them to deploy R&D and their sort of existing skill set into finding solutions to some of these challenges is going to be absolutely crucial to making any progress. Happily for investors who have a financial returns focus, it is also an area where there's growth. There is opportunity to make a financial return if you are able to deliver solutions that genuinely have kind of additionality, that have the ability to make progress, make change. Because whilst that isn't the whole of a competitive positioning, it's part of being strongly positioned within what is a structurally growing market with very, very strong underpinnings. And so from an investment standpoint, I think it is somewhere where it's quite compelling to encourage asset owners to think about deploying some of their capital, partly as a hedge, frankly, against the risk they have elsewhere across their exposures, but also as a way of doing better, as a way of sort of remaining relevant to the future that they want to be part of, as a way of mitigating the long-term risk that they have in terms of physical risk in their existing asset base, but also as a way of generating financial return within a sort of nearer term time horizon. I'm slightly biased because it's what I do, but I think it is a really important part of this transition. So if that's sort of the way that I approach this, what you see here is something you'll see all of the time. The top line is trying to list out some of the activities globally which are causing the problem. They're pretty diverse. They're pretty much everything that we do is the reality. And the bottom line is the vectors through which that damage is being created. This, I'm sure, is familiar to all of you. The reason it's important when we're trying to formulate investment solutions here is that it's very difficult to quantify the impact that any solution has on biodiversity. It is marginally easier to quantify the impact that those solutions have on these vectors. I mean, I'm not suggesting this is perfect and that we have the answers, but it is a way of starting to think about measuring. It's a way of starting to think about where we need to be focusing capital in order to make progress. And it's this that we use to sort of couch the investment universe, if you like, for these kind of strategies. It's something where we're pushing data providers and corporates to disclose better because it's at least theoretically to an extent measurable, which is obviously key to being able to demonstrate competitive positioning and progress. In terms of how that filters through to what we actually look at, in order to run a listed equity strategy that is able to deliver the financial returns that an asset owner requires, this is money that somebody's worked very hard to save, to earn, and is looking for a return over time. This isn't philanthropy. There does need to be a financial return if we're going to attract to this space sufficient quantity of capital to deliver some of the progress that we need. And so it's important that one is able to diversify risk, construct a portfolio that is compelling and that can function through macroeconomic cycles, changing political environments, can sort of manage through the fits and starts that you see in terms of policy progress, etc. And we think you can do that here. This is the way that we couch it across these 4 different sub-themes. To me, these are the areas where there are real challenges, but where we need solutions. There are some things that we just need to stop doing. But we're not trying to invest for... If we're honest, biodiversity would be completely fine if we all ceased to exist tomorrow. It would recover very rapidly, but clearly that's not a future that we would deem to be kind of economically and societally palatable. And so what we're investing for is something which is a kind of a livable, viable future that we feel is achievable. And we think it's achievable through these different sort of sets of solutions. And what we do is we screen from MSCI Acqui, so a very large part of the global listed equity base. We screen for companies that have exposure to these different areas. So, and we do that actively. You can't do this passively. I mean, I've been investing across some of these solutions for 20 odd years, and my team have a huge amount, decades of experience between them. And there is no way to screen for this passively, not in terms of where your revenue sits. It's not how corporates report. And so we look company by company, activity by activity, vertical by vertical, and we pull together a universe of what we think is about 400 companies listed globally at the moment. And then within that, what we do is we sort of work through a series of processes to identify companies that we think can generate returns from this, can deliver progress, have a combination of current products and R&D expertise such that they can keep delivering progress. And that means two things. It means that we achieve some of the goals that we have with regard to biodiversity, but it also means these companies remain relevant, ought to retain their market share, pricing power, have the sort of potential to keep investing, and you see that virtual circle as a result. So that's kind of the process that we go through, and we are looking for financial returns. It doesn't always sound nice, I think, when we're talking about a problem which is so human, but the reality is, firstly, this is money that somebody has earned and somebody needs for the future, but also the scale of capital that is necessary in this space is not going to shift in the direction of funding the gap that exists in the absence of financial return, not in the sort of public markets that we invest in. And so I think the onus is on us as investors to demonstrate that we can do this credibly, make progress, but still deliver a palatable financial return. For me, that doesn't involve the tech Mag 7 stocks that some of my peers choose to hold. I would suggest that they're at least as much part of the problem as they are the solution. They are aligned with a trajectory which is not about delivering progress for biodiversity. It's not what this strategy is supposed to do. And I think it is perfectly possible to achieve the kind of returns profile that one is looking for without holding those things. Actually, I don't think it's helpful to clients either, because they probably have that exposure somewhere else. So yeah, in terms of measurement, it's tough. You know, and we know we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail. For us, we try to measure KPIs against those vectors that we spoke about. We think that's helpful. We couch that when we're speaking with clients with single stock case studies and often single project case studies. There is no perfect aggregatable portfolio level metric available that can demonstrate, I think, the value of the solutions in which we're investing. There's a huge amount of progress that is still required here, but I don't think there's ever going to be a perfect, simple solution. Great. Thank you very much.
My name's Will Pearse. So I'm at Imperial College London, where I'm a researcher. I'm also a fellow now at the Alan Turing Institute, where I lead a program thinking about fundamental AI research. I'm going to be trying to explain to you what biodiversity is to somebody who is a biodiversity scientist in a way that hopefully will help you in your own work. So in my own work, as I say, I try to think about the origins and consequences of biodiversity. And so that involves developing a lot of tools to rapidly assess biodiversity using acoustic sensors, drones, satellite work, and then working directly with policymakers, sometimes the corporate sector, sometimes sort of government, sometimes NGOs, to try and manage biodiversity and the implications for human health. I think we probably all know a little bit that we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis, but it's important for a minute just to, I think, consider what it is and why everybody should care, not just someone like me who, I'm wearing a suit, but I could be described as a bit of a tree hugger, right? I love biodiversity. So why should you all care? Okay, so right now, conservatively, 1 million species are facing imminent extinction. So that's plants, butterflies, birds, cuddly mammals, whatever. And that really matters because in the same way that we have the IPCC that thinks about climate change, we have the IPBES, which thinks about biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they categorize the things that biodiversity does for us, ecosystem services. If today you have breathed air, if you have drunk water, if you have eaten food, you have depended on biodiversity. But biodiversity also protects us from floods. It protects us from fires, okay? And so biodiversity does a lot of things that is incredibly valuable for us. If I told you that we could make right now a wall that would self-repair itself and would stop any floods from happening, you'd think that was amazing. I've just described a wetland, Okay? So biodiversity has the capacity to adapt and respond and to give us essentially what we need. And very much it's possible to put a dollar value on that. So one of the areas of my own research, I won't be talking about that today really, is where we can measure how biodiversity affects the rate of delivery of these services. And we can estimate that because of course that is inherently valuable. So what I want to try and give you right now is a feeling of what biodiversity is to a biodiversity scientist, okay? And so I'm not going to claim I'm going to give you 10,000 pages in 10 minutes, but what I am going to try and give you is the gestalt, the general feeling of how a biodiversity scientist thinks about biodiversity. How at the end of a three-year degree, there we go, all right, okay, you're going to broadly speaking think about biodiversity. Now stop for a moment and look at these two sides. Imagine you went out and you surveyed some insects in a place over on the left and some insects in a place over on the right. Think for a moment which of these you would think has the most biodiversity in them. I'm not going to quiz you, but just think for a second. Now, if you went with the one on the left, you'd be wrong. And if you went for the one on the right, you'd be wrong. Because biodiversity is not one thing. If, like me, you have one of those silly fitness watches that registers something about you, you know how it tells you more than one number about yourself? You know how you'd be surprised if you went to the hospital and you had a medical checkup and the doctor gave you a number between 0 and 1 and said, good, you're 0.7. You go, hey, that would be surprising, wouldn't it? Biodiversity is much the same. It is not one particular number. So on the left, we have more kinds of species, a red kind of butterfly, a black kind of butterfly, and a dragonfly. And on the right, we have a black kind of butterfly and an ant. So yes, there's more species on the left. But on the left, we have more what we call dominant. There's a dominance of species. Almost everything is a red kind of butterfly. Whereas over on the right, we have more kinds of evenness. We have less dominance. There's equal numbers of the black and yellow butterflies in comparison with the ants. Similarly, on the left, everything is the same kind of biodiversity. They're all things that fly around. Whereas over on the right, we have butterflies. If any of you know about biodiversity, you might say, oh, but sometimes ants fly. I saw someone at the back. I see you, okay? So broadly speaking, they don't fly, apart from one time a year, okay? But importantly, they're ecosystem engineers. They fundamentally alter ecosystem processes. If we were to try and measure biodiversity on one axis, we would miss this, okay? Each of these is quantifiable, okay? But fundamentally, the number of species, broadly the distribution of evenness, the dominance, and the kinds of biodiversity matter. Biodiversity is a metric of samples. And I will tell you this now, I have literally never, in my entire career, found a thing that an ecosystem does that is best predicted by species richness, which is what everyone tends to think about. So species richness is a metric of biodiversity, but I have literally never known it to be the best one. Literally, never known it to be the most useful metric. So to the UK government, biodiversity is kind of this, the statutory biodiversity metric main menu. It's an Excel spreadsheet, okay? But it boils down to basically how many trees you have in an area, okay? And so right now, in terms of the biodiversity net gain tool, it's how many trees are around and the kinds of trees to a certain extent. And that's why they have this handy thing at the top of it, the tree helper, that helps you keep track of how many trees you have measured. What do you do if you're measuring a river, I hear you ask? You count the trees nearby the river. So, what metric should industry use? If you are trying to think right now whether it's in terms of a local scale intervention or a broad global scale intervention, I want you to follow my rule of 3, okay? So, I may be about to be shot for this, but I'm giving a specific suggestion. So to be compliant with whatever a regulator may choose in the future, follow my rule of 3 and you'll be fine. Sue me if you're not. Okay? Study 3 kinds of groups, use 3 kinds of metrics, and do it 3 times, 3 ways. What do I mean by that? 3 groups. In the UK, but broadly everywhere, that means measure some plants, measure some birds, and measure something else. The something else will depend a bit on where you are, but honestly, plants and birds, almost anyone can survey those. So go for that. Plants and birds and something else. Measure 3 kinds of metrics. It could be something about the species richness, sure. Could be something about the traits of that species, whether they fly, how often they fly. I'm looking at you again at the back. This poor person, I'm staring at the back. Okay? And something else. 3 kinds of ways of summarizing the kinds of species that you find there. and then do it 3 times, before something happened, after something happened, and either forecast into the future or have some kind of reference condition. So, easier to think of it to begin with when thinking about a local scale intervention. I went out and I paid my consultant to count the trees, birds and bats, 3 things, and then plotted the species richness, evenness, and the variation in their body mass at that site, that's 3 things by the way, at that site and at a nearby park. That's with reference to something else. Success is when we're similar to that park. A KPI is baked in. Now, a reasonable surveyor can do that at any site in 1 day. If you are thinking about a global scale intervention, things become more difficult. You have to start thinking about remote sense products, and I'd be happy to talk more about that in the questions if you're interested in that. But ultimately, 3 groups, 3 metrics, and 3 times, and broadly speaking, you'll be robust, and you can ensure that that ecosystem will be providing the services that people depend upon, supporting human well-being. It won't just be making biodiversity better, it'll be making human beings happier, well-fed, and healthier in the long run. So with that, thank you very much.
So I have a follow-up question to you, Will. So how, since you brought up BNG and you brought up Will's rule of 3, so the UK BNG is receiving a lot of attention because it's new and a lot of countries are looking to the UK to see how this works out. And you showed us the spreadsheet, which some of us actually have played around with. And I'm just curious, what are the pros and cons? How does it compare to Will's rule of 3? What sort of rules do they follow? How good is it?
Yeah, so I want to start up because obviously I know some of the people who developed it. You know, it is fantastic that it exists, right? And it's fantastic that it is very specific and it's repeatable and anyone can play around with it. So that is wonderful. I don't think anyone thinks that this is the end of the day in terms of biodiversity monitoring. I don't think, importantly, anyone thinks that this best maps onto the ecosystem services that support human well-being, but also help businesses work best. So trees are great and they're easy to count. It's a starting point. If we want to start making sure we're maximising flood protection, minimising the risk of fires, maximising the rate at which crops grow, this is not necessarily the tool that we would want. And so I would expect, indeed it is already happening, that there's going to be some engagement with those broader aspects and that this tool will be updated, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years. But it is a fantastic first step, of course, yeah.
And then a question to Amanda. When listening to what Will said about biodiversity metrics, and again, since we're so easy to remember Will's rule of 3, how does that compare with the KPIs and the various screening methods and metrics you use as a sort of philosophy?
Yeah. So I would say that because we're operating on such a large scale and we're looking at a solution which is usually deployed by the customer of the company in which we're investing, we tend to be a step removed. And typically the companies that are doing this well measure very, very carefully the benefits that they achieve in this sort of context for their customers. So it requires them to have a sort of an integrated ongoing relationship with their customers such that they can report back over a period of 3, 5, 7, 10 years what progress has been achieved. And that's great when we see it, and we can use that in sort of case study format. But if we're looking at a company that is, for instance, able to, monitor and mitigate contaminants into water supplies, for instance, it's quite difficult to make the assertion of what benefit you've had in terms of biodiversity. So you can infer that we can measure that the water quality is better, and that would be a bare minimum expectation. And that's the kind of thing that we can KPI and we can see progress with. And as you say, we would typically be looking at that in the context of what natural, untouched, equivalent nature water quality would look like. But you have to then make an inference as to what that means in terms of biodiversity gain, because we can assume that the improved water quality has improved biodiversity, but if somebody else further down the road has, built a concrete car park or something, there's going to be a negative impact the other way. It's very difficult to attribute the biodiversity gain to the solution being deployed, and that's where it gets really tricky in practice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would help for me to respond to that. So I think that's a really good point. And you know, on the ground and also at the desk, right, when you're serving these things, it is very difficult to track it back. I think what's important is that they notice how you're making use of a reference.
Yep.
So something's being compared with a reference. But I think also it's important to drill down a little bit and make use of some of the existing products that are actually out there that can help with some of these things. Yep. So, for example, there's a thing called the Biodiversity Intactness Index,
yep.
which is and that actually is a number between 0 and 117%, that will tell you how intact the biodiversity is in an area. And you can use that to forecast forward and think about what the impacts of particular interventions would be on biodiversity. I would also encourage people to be sceptical of assuming that just because a particular environmental condition has been changed, the biodiversity will respond along with it. But luckily, you can often measure and look to see if people are measuring the consequences of that biodiversity. Because, of course, if you are embedding a system within a healthy ecosystem, lots of the operations of that system will be cheaper. For example, people don't often think about this. We think about minimizing risks and minimizing impacts. But if you actually have a healthy, biodiverse freshwater system associated with a treatment plant, guess what? You won't have to pay as much for bioremediation because the ecosystem will do it for you. So if you look to see if people are actually checking the efficiency of their systems, if they're actually checking and developing KPIs that are appropriate like that, you'll also find the company is operating more efficiently because it's operating more effectively.
Yeah. Which is the sole reason that many of the customers of the kind of companies we invest in buy those solutions in the first place. You know, many of the drivers tend to be at a corporate level, cost savings or efficiency savings or risk management, or it's about uptime for their operations because you don't have interruptions to ecosystem services on which they are dependent. You know, that's often the reason that these solutions are deployed. It's not always done expressly because a corporate has decided they want to protect biodiversity.
I agree. I think that's an emerging thing. And I'm repeatedly seeing people now moving from this idea of how can you measure biodiversity to make sure that I undo the damage I did towards how can we work with the biodiversity so that we do it quicker and more and cheaper. So, you know, it's very exciting, I think.
I think it would be wonderful if we could, increase the overlap in those Venn diagrams between what's good for the business and what's good for nature. I mean, in the end, the more overlap, the easier this will be. I think it's safe to say also that we will never get an easy way out like a CO2 or CO2 equivalent metric for biodiversity. I think that's safe to say, and that's okay. And we can probably work in that space and find a consensus where there's a lot of good work out there to try to find that subset of metrics that can altogether capture, hopefully, most of what we're looking for. I see that time is flying, and I would therefore like to open the floor to questions to make sure that we have ample opportunity. Yes.
I'm just wondering if the best approach to achieving biodiversity is to just encourage the natural system to do its thing, or is it to introduce new species, new adaptations of sorts to promote that biodiversity?
Great question. Will?
So that is a great question, thank you. And so there's an emerging idea, we call it rewilding, where you try to bring back the natural processes that operate within an ecosystem. I'm a bit biased because I sit on the rewilding special interest group, the British Ecological Society, so I think it's great. But I sit there and I do that because it's cheaper and it's better for biodiversity, therefore, and it's also better for people. So bringing back in the natural processes, though, is the key thing. So what you often need to do is you need to make sure you undo whatever has stopped those processes from operating, because otherwise they would just would have recommenced on their own. And then you have to make sure it's a natural process. You want to make sure the species that have evolved together to form that ecosystem are able to interact with one another to recommence those original processes. And quite often actually bringing in novel species that haven't co-evolved with those species can have unintended consequences. So to a certain extent, getting out of the way, certainly, and undoing the damage, but making sure you allow those natural processes to restart is key.
Next. Sorry.
I was just going to say that, there are many instances of businesses that we look at where operationally, by moving back towards dependency upon kind of native tree species, for instance, so a forestry business which chooses to set aside 50% of its forestry assets, and then within that 50% chooses to mosaic manage and leave 50% of that 50% replanted with native species, will often actually improve its yield and financial returns as a result of doing that. So it looks like you've sort of given away 75% of your acreage, if you like, but actually it isn't necessarily to the detriment of your financial return, and actually in the long term it sort of protects you from wildfires, it gives you a license to operate, it helps you with issues around local kind of land rights challenges that you might be facing, and at the same time you get this operational benefit. So I think the two things, I think it makes sense to always come back to something more natural. This lady here has been kicked in the Navy.
Go on, please.
Hi, my name is Pooja, and I'm a PhD researcher at the Center for Transport Engineering and Modeling, so I'm an oddball here, but it's all part of the same nexus. I had a question for you, Amanda, possibly. What about nature tech? You talked about metrics, right? Because you need data to quantify, help investors decide whether it's worth investing in social environmental projects that yield good returns, but is also socially responsible. I was wanting to know about nature tech, and in terms of what do you think, or what do you know about using AI and satellites to measure biodiversity, as this provides you quantifiable data on the changing ecosystem, because they're all coalesce to each other. Thanks.
I think, so AI is a hugely complex and sensitive, challenging area. We have internally a sort of sustainability research team who we spend a lot of time discussing and debating this specific topic with. I feel very strongly that the kind of strategies I operate should not be supporting the growth in kind of mainstream AI, because as we sort of touched upon, I think it's a big challenge to us rather than a solution necessarily. That said, there are applications within AI which are very valuable. So, we've been looking recently a lot at the ways in which it can support the monitoring of water quality, the ability to mitigate some of the obvious ongoing contamination issues we have, which are a huge problem. And these can be solutions which are sort of cost effective, relatively straightforward to deploy. The technology exists. And the payback periods in terms of environmental gain can be very, very short. And so I definitely think there is a role there. And then I think the other area which you mentioned, some of the kind of surveillance solutions. So for instance, there are satellite technologies which can look at how much of a certified forest has been felled and then can track that through sort of weights on trucks, where the trucks have moved to, and then what's being logged as a certified forestry asset further downstream, so that you've got some kind of certification and demonstration in what you've done. Clearly, those kind of applications are hugely important, and it's not going to be possible, I think, to monetize this sort of progress without being able to demonstrate through these kind of solutions. So that unquestionably they have a role, but I think we've got to be really, really careful which businesses we're supporting, what their motivations are, what value they're able to add, and thinking really, really seriously about the operational footprint of those businesses and ensuring that they're doing everything that they can to mitigate that within their own sort of footprint.
If I might add something incredibly quickly in there, those are some fantastic examples of how AI and remote sensing can be really useful. I think it's really important when speaking with someone who's using remote sensing satellite products to ask key questions about what exactly they're measuring and how they've verified what they're measuring. I'm quite often approached by people who started up a consultancy or something like that, and they want to use machine learning to count the amount of green pixels on a landscape and say that's biodiversity. Lots of things are green. Those were some fantastic examples of it, but you need to ask those key questions of how do you know that that is a natural ecosystem that is contributing ecosystem services. And there are ways of doing that with remote sense products that are fantastic, and you gave some great examples there.
Yes, my question is quite related with the previous question. The only difference is you are using an approach that is called, let's say, natural-based solution for biodiversity. What I'm interested in is not so much on natural-based solution, but as data-based solution. When I say data, this means you can have a new approach that is called space data. I'm not referring from satellite. I'm talking about data from the space, from the, let's say, ecosystem itself, and this data, should tell you exactly where you stay on biodiversity, where is going on, why this happens. In other words, it's more a knowledge approach solution researching the data. Not so much AI. AI is a process, but the approach is, what we call it, is data-based approach. Or as the European Union is moving now, is this concept of data space initiative to solve problems. Thanks.
So was that a question? I'm not sure who was.
The question is, the approach is different. What do you think about the approach of data-based solution and yours that is more nature-based solution?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So I would say what you've described is the field of ecology. And the field of ecology. So ecology is the study of how biodiversity and ecosystems are structured, and we do that by going out into an ecosystem and measuring things about it. So I think it's exciting that we have a whole new range of technologies like bioacoustics, like drones, and also old-fashioned things like, as you're sort of describing to a certain extent, looking and counting and writing it down, that can measure biodiversity. But it's important to take those and turn them into key performance indicators that tell you about that biodiversity. And indeed, there are a number of metrics that can be estimated like that. Like whether the species richness is going up or down, whether the abundance is going up or down, and whether you have more kinds of biodiversity in the system.
Do I have time for one more? Who's, yes, one. Yes, please. I think over there, please.
Yeah, thank you for that interesting talk. I'm with Munich Re, responsible for nature-based risk solutions. It's such a big topic. How do you explain the combination between Jim, who alluded to getting a lot of finance into energy, but not into nature and agriculture, and you putting the importance of nature and biodiversity in front and saying this is 50% of our global GDP that is dependent on that. So how does this go together? Where are the discussing streams not meeting? I know that's a different question, a difficult question, and I wanted to pose that to Jim, but I was not able to do that. So sorry for that.
If I can just start, and I'm sure you have a view on this too. I mean, we're not going to solve one of these problems without the other. One of the most crucial things about our natural ecosystem services is that they help us to manage carbon emissions, manage temperature extremes, and so we will not solve the sort of energy transition crisis without addressing our natural capital crisis. And equally, if we continue to emit carbon at the rate that we are and warm the climate, as those slides earlier showed, we're not going to address the losses that we're creating in terms of nature and the degradation that we're seeing of natural capital. So I think the two go hand in hand. I don't really see a trade-off. We are earlier in the stages with this issue than the specific narrow sort of trying to address carbon emissions, not that we're doing a brilliant job of that either. We need more capital into all of this space, and I think we are earlier in terms of sort of recognising that and thinking about how we can measure and demonstrate and monitor and progress here. But what I would say is that the effects of the degradation of natural capital are so immediate that it's much easier and more tangible, I think, for us to see that and to have a propensity to change. So when I started investing around emissions reductions 20 years ago, I mean, you used to sit down and talk to regulators who didn't really believe in climate change, couldn't envisage what all of this was going to mean, and couldn't compute that we might one day have a carbon credit that costs more than 20 euros because it was going to be far too expensive for German auto manufacturers. And clearly we've moved a long way past that, but the pace at which this transition and sort of rhetoric around it has moved is so much quicker. I just think we've got so much more imagination and ability to see why it matters and that we have to act now.
What I normally say to people is that the major driver of biodiversity loss right now is land conversion for agriculture. And that's also a major driver of climate change as well. So the wonderful thing is you actually get more crop production when you bring biodiversity into the system, so that's good. And also we want to feed more people because that is the right thing to do. People deserve to have a happy life where they can eat. And so I think the way I normally frame it is we want to feed people, and to do that we can save biodiversity. And that will also help us fight climate change. And so I normally sort of try and frame it like that. And I think that gives a direct link there in terms of what we want to invest in, more efficient and effective agriculture.
Thank you very much. I think actually that's a great point to end on. I think we need to think of this as sort of a mosaic, if you will, where climate change, biodiversity, nature, they all fit together. And in addition to the wonderful examples given by these two, I could think of one sort of immediately. If you're going to invest in renewable energy, for let's say a wind farm, a solar panel, more and more now you can do that in a nature-friendly way. And they're integrating sort of sheep grazing, rewilding of sites at the same time. There's possibly some trade-off with space, but still there's ways of doing these things together. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much to my panel. Yeah.